Hey everyone, so let's talk about Thanksgiving. We're going to carve into one of America's most cherished traditions. But you know that story we all learned in grade school? Well, it turns out it's more myth than reality. So let's peel back those layers and find out what really went down. I mean, we all have that picture in our heads, right? Pilgrims in their hats, Native Americans in their finery, all sharing this big peaceful feast back in 1621. But that iconic image? It's pretty much fiction. So that brings us to the big question. How much of the Thanksgiving story that we all know and love is actually true? All right, so let's start with that story, the picture perfect myth. You know the one I'm talking about. The struggling pilgrims are saved by their super friendly Wampanoag neighbors, and they all have this harmonious meal together. It's a really nice founding story about cooperation and gratitude. But here's the thing. That story, the one we celebrate every year, it wasn't really born in 1621 at all. It was actually put together and made popular almost 200 years later. And the reasons for it had way less to do with a harvest meal and a lot more to do with the politics of a very different and very divided America. So, what was this political journey all about? Well, making Thanksgiving a national holiday every year, that wasn't some tradition that was just naturally passed down from the Pilgrims. Nope, it was a very calculated, very long campaign. And the main person behind it was a woman you've probably never heard of, Sarah Josepha Hale. She was a super influential magazine editor back in the 19th century, and she had this big idea that a national day of Thanksgiving could help bring the country together, a country that was literally being torn apart at the seams over slavery. And check this out. George Washington actually tried to create a National Day of Thanks way back in 1789, but it just didn't catch on. It literally took Sarah Josepha Hale's campaign, which lasted 36 years, by the way, to make it a thing. Finally, in 1863, right in the middle of the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln made it an official national holiday, hoping to create a sense of unity. And get this, the date wasn't even locked in until 1941. So the holiday we celebrate is, for sure, a 19th century invention. Okay, so if the holiday we know was really cooked up in the 1800s, what actually happened at that harvest festival back in 1621? Let's deconstruct this first feast and see how the myths stack up against the facts. First up, the invitation. The myth is that the Pilgrims sent out these really nice, friendly invites. But the fact is quite different. The Wampanoag leader Massasoit showed up with 90 of his warriors. Why? Because they heard a bunch of gunfire and were worried the colonists were preparing an attack. So, yeah, it was less a friendly dinner party and more of a cautious political meetup. And who brought the food? The story we hear is that the Pilgrims put out this huge, bountiful feast, but the only person who actually wrote about it at the time says that Massasoit's men brought 5 deer. 5! That was probably most of the meat for the entire 3-day event. So, what about the classic menu? Turkey, mashed potatoes, pumpkin pie, the works? Not even close. They probably ate that venison we just talked about, some wild birds like geese or ducks, a type of corn porridge, and maybe some cooked pumpkin. I mean, think about it. They had no sugar for cranberry sauce, no flour for pie crusts, and potatoes hadn't even come to North America yet. You know, the idea that this meal kicked off some long and lasting peace is probably the biggest myth of all, because just one generation later, the relationship had completely fallen apart. The settlers' constant push for more land led to a horrible conflict called King Philip's War, which just devastated the Wampanoag Nation and ended any chance of friendship. Okay, so if they probably didn't even eat turkey at that first gathering, how in the world did it become the absolute star of the modern Thanksgiving meal? Well, the answer, once again, takes us back to the 19th century. The turkey's rise to fame was really a mix of smart marketing and just plain old practicality. Our friend Sarah Josepha Hale pushed it hard in her magazine as the perfect Thanksgiving bird. It's big, it's American, and it can feed a whole family. Plus, the idea got a huge boost from Charles Dickens's A Christmas Carol, which kind of cemented a big bird as the symbol of a holiday feast. But for many, many people, the story of Thanksgiving isn't about celebration at all. It is absolutely essential that we understand the counter-narrative, which looks at this holiday from a completely different and very painful point of view. So, since 1970, many Native Americans and their allies have marked the fourth Thursday of November, not as Thanksgiving, but as a national day of mourning. For them, it's a day to remember the genocide of their ancestors, the theft of their lands, and to protest the ongoing injustices they still face today. And this day of protest started for a very specific reason. In 1970, for the 350th anniversary of the Pilgrims' arrival, a Wampanoag leader named Wamsutta Frank James was invited to give a speech. But when the organizers read it beforehand and saw that he told the harsh truth about what that arrival meant for his people, they refused to let him give it. They censored him. So in response, he and his supporters created the National Day of Mourning right then and there. And here's a line from that speech they tried to silence. He wrote, "The Pilgrims had hardly explored the shores of Cape Cod for 4 days before they had robbed the graves of my ancestors and stolen their corn and beans." Wow. I mean, that quote really gets to the heart of why that picture-perfect myth we started with can be so deeply painful. So where does all this leave us? We have a holiday that's built on a 19th century myth about a 17th century event. It's a day that means unity and family for some, but represents profound loss and injustice for others. Look, understanding this more complex history doesn't mean you can't feel gratitude, but it does challenge us all to think a little more deeply about what exactly we're celebrating. So I'll just leave you with this. How does knowing the full, real story change what Thanksgiving means to you?